Currently, there are 9 states that are armed with nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, People's Republic of China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. There were other states which had nuclear weapons which have since given them up, though, after developing them or inheriting them from earlier states. These states are South Africa, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. With South Africa, they gave up their nuclear weapons as a gesture of goodwill during the transition to a new type of government, you could say, during the end of apartheid. The former Soviet republics of Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, they all gave up their nuclear weapons to the Russian Federation, who is set to be the successor state of the Soviet Union, as part of agreements with the whole nuclear non-proliferation regime, and they were given economic and geopolitical concessions for doing so. But now I think it's safe to say that Ukraine regrets this decision, as if they had their nuclear weapons still, the war that started in February of 2022 wouldn't have happened, or would be very, very unlikely to have happened, let's just say. And after Israel and then ultimately America helped them in the 12-Day War, I assume that Iran thinks that developing nuclear fissile material solely for nuclear power kind of is a dead end, because it leaves them open for attack. So if they're going to do so, why don't they just build nuclear weapons too and prevent any future attacks from Israel and the United States, who have shown their eagerness and readiness to attack them? So Iran also sees in retrospect this justification to have nuclear weapons. Likewise, there's the question of Taiwan or the Republic of China. There's always this seeming threat, and there's always this seeming scare of a future mainland invasion of Taiwan. While the Civil War ended in 1950, and this invasion has never occurred to this day, with a large conventional war breaking out with Ukraine, the question of a large conventional war breaking out with Taiwan, I don't think that that's as much off the table anymore. And Taiwan, they previously had a nuclear weapons program, and rumors persist that they were quite close to developing their own capacity to use nuclear weapons to defend themselves and as a deterrent against the mainland. So they ended up giving up their program in the end of the 1980s as part of them transitioning to a democracy, and from international pressure that was occurring at the end of the Cold War. I assume that Taiwan, or many Taiwanese, like with Ukraine, probably feel that this was a mistake. Because the reality is that we all know that there's not been a nuclear war since the Second World War. And there hasn't been a real great power on great power war since the Korean War. And that is because of the risk and fear of the risk of nuclear weapons being used in any such war. There's no doubt about that. The threat of the use of these weapons and the fear of the devastation which they would bring have no doubt pacified the world since World War II. As the threat of war between any two nuclear states creates a situation of mutually assured destruction, or something similar to the Nash equilibrium and game theory, where neither party has any reason to start a war, as they know doing so will devastate them, as the other party has deterrents to prevent them and would result in their devastation. Likewise, nations that don't have nuclear weapons, they have no reason to ever attack nations that do, or perhaps even defend themselves from nations that have nuclear weapons. Perhaps it's likely that they'll be bullied into conceding to aggression from a nuclear power. So then that brings up the question, are nuclear weapons a good thing? Since I think that they're a core reason that we haven't seen that many international wars since the Second World War. That they're at the core of the general peace that we've had since then. Well, I think I got to answer the question if they're a good thing with yes and no. And just because something has not happened, we have to remember that doesn't mean that it will continue to not happen forever. We have to remember that there has been a nuclear war. The Second World War was a nuclear war. Nuclear war doesn't just mean one side has nukes and the other side has nukes and they use them against each other. A nuclear war is any war in which nuclear weapons are used. And indeed, their use in the Second World War is not something to be taken lightly. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens died because of that. So those were with very tiny weapons, and those were with 2 single uses. Now, a modern use of nuclear weapons in, again, where it's one-sided, that could result in hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths. It would be just as destructive as almost any other conventional war, if not more destructive than any conventional war we've had since the end of World War II itself. And I'm going to touch on that again because I think that people forget about the danger of a one-sided nuclear war. When we talk about nuclear war, there's this obsession with the Fallout or the Mad Max or the Doctor Strangelove type nuclear war, mutually assured destruction type nuclear war. But there are many more uses of nuclear weapons that can happen. And so the reality is, as long as there's nuclear weapons, and the more that there is in the world, the threat of nuclear weapons and their use will always continue. And the more time that there is, the more likely that the minute possibility that such a war would happen becomes. It's an ever-present danger, regardless of your viewpoint of them acting as a credible deterrence. Despite the focus on the buildup of nuclear weapons by, historians during the Cold War, and this occurring on both sides of the Soviet Union and the United States, and to a lesser extent France and Britain, the buildup and threat of nuclear weapons there was actually kind of minor, because the threat there, it's in a bipolar paradigm. The Cold War was bipolar, not just in the direct threat of some kind of war over Cuba or some kind of war over the unification of Germany. It was bipolar all over the place. When smaller nations had conflicts, the United States and the Soviet Union were so influential there that they were able to negotiate ends of those conflicts because of their immense strength, their immense soft power, and their nuclear power, or their ability to have a nuclear umbrella and protect their allies. Now we're moving beyond, say, a bipolar world, or perhaps a world policeman era, American hegemony era. We're moving more and more to an era of at least 3 great powers, if not more in the future. And with those 3 great powers, the United States, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China, I think that the argument could be made, even with the United States, each of those 3 powers is weaker than either of the powers during the course of the Cold War. And that there's also, with these 3 great powers coming up, there are middle powers that are able to act independently in a way that they did not during the bipolar world, the bipolar paradigm of the Cold War. Middle powers like India, Israel, Pakistan, Brazil, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and possibly others. And those middle powers, some of them have nukes, and some of them have an incentive to develop nukes. And with that paradigm in the Cold War, those powers could be controlled from outside or curtailed in their threat towards each other and starting a war outside of the bipolar dynamic of the Cold War because of the outmoded power of the Soviet Union and the United States. But with the tripolar paradigm, and with each of the tripolar states being less powerful now, I think that their ability to influence other powers not to engage in war is much more limited now. We are entering an era of history in which I think that minor powers' ability to trust nuclear superpowers to defend themselves is declining. This idea of the nuclear umbrella, that Japan or Germany or Turkey or Italy or whatever ally of the United States will not develop their own weapons of mass destruction because they can depend upon the United States to defend them with a nuclear umbrella and America's deterrence to work for them. I think that that era is coming to an end, especially after all the aggressive international wars that have happened lately. The Ukraine war, the Gaza war, the 12-day war. I think that we're reaching an atmosphere where states are reviewing this idea of the nuclear umbrella, and that they want to have a contingency plan outside of America or Russia or China's ability to deter aggression. And that creates an incentive for them to join in on the proliferation of nuclear weapons, to have their own independent deterrence. And I think that there's an obvious danger with any type of proliferation. As it goes on, that means that there are more independent, non-block nuclear armed states. And once you have more and more nuclear armed states, the paradigm for some kind of future nuclear war moves away from this kind of bipolar give and take of the United States and the Soviet Union, or the United States and the Russian Federation, and you're moving towards this multipolar paradigm where there are different avenues of conflict which can occur between different nations that are armed with nuclear weapons. And when you only have this bipolar paradigm within the Cold War, or even within India versus Pakistan, you know how to negotiate out of that. The bureaucracy and systemization of diplomacy to create an off-ramp in times of tension or crisis, it's already pre-built before that tension or crisis happens between Russia and the United States today, and to a lesser extent between Pakistan and India. But once you have more and more states that could come into tension or conflict, there won't be pre-existing diplomatic infrastructure to help them dissuade themselves out of armed conflict. It's just the reality that the more and more multipolar the world is, the more and more you have independent powers that are autonomous outside of the influence of superpowers or great powers, then the reality for there to be more and more international wars increases. There's no... It's just that throughout all of human history, we know that when one power either conquers all the others or is able to stress its hegemony over all others, the result is peace. So the irony is that the way to create peace in human history is to conquer everybody else, ironically, because, you know, if you have the Mongols, or you have Rome, or you have the Chinese empires, or the United States, or even a division of two powers like the United States and the Soviet Union, then that unparalleled singular power creates a situation in which international wars become rarer and rarer. But once you move outside of this into a multipolar world, the possibility for international war not just between multiple great powers, but between smaller powers becomes greater and greater. And our history with nuclear weapons before now, it's really been defined by either a bipolar world structure between the Soviet Union and the United States, or a kind of hegemonic world structure with the United States as the sole superpower. And so our experience with nuclear weapons and our understanding with them is foundationally changed, I think, with a multipolar structure and the drive that that will create for more proliferation. So imagine, if you will, the Asia Pacific region of the future, in which the United States is no longer able to be a reasonable nuclear umbrella to defend its allies or to provide deterrence for them against the People's Republic of China and to a lesser extent North Korea. Perhaps the United States, it had pretty dire economic consequences, and this is not something that is, pie in the sky fantasy stuff. The United States is in an incredible amount of debt. Maybe it will have to just abandon its internationally powerful military. It'll have to scrap its navy because the dollar will just fall through. And so the United States will no longer have a presence in the Asia Pacific region. Or even worse, you could say, there's some kind of civil conflict, maybe even a civil war within the United States that prevents it from acting externally. Keep in mind that when the United States had its civil war in the 1860s, the result was that European powers began to intervene a lot more in the New World. Spain took back the Dominican Republic. It fell under the Kingdom of Spain. And France outright invaded Mexico and established the Empire of Mexico. So if the United States is stuck in its own internal conflicts, the likelihood of it being able of its commitments to NATO and its commitments to Asia falling through, that means that there's a greater likelihood for conflict in those regions. So America pulls back. That means that you have its pretty direct allies where America has troops there, South Korea and Japan, which are, in conflict with nuclear powers. They have an incentive to develop their own nuclear weapons, to have their own deterrence against these aggressors, North Korea and the People's Republic of China. And while the United States may not have troops sanctioned in Taiwan, we know that that is an incredibly likely avenue for a future war. And without any kind of presence in the region, the backroom deals and the supposed defense of the United States for Taiwan, it'll dry up. And Taiwan would have the incentive to develop their own weapons of mass destruction. And you have to remember that outside of the United States, direct alliance with countries like South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, and Asia, Australia and New Zealand, its presence in the region has this general pacifying effect that dissuades China from exerting its naval muscles in the South China Sea against Southeast Asia. That China won't bully those countries because America's there. So, without America, these other countries that are more closely allied in Southeast Asia, well, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, they'll have their own incentive to develop nuclear weapons. You have to keep in mind that Vietnam, it's not is that well integrated into the international system and with the United States because it's a communist state and it's at odds with China. So I think one of the countries in the world that we don't talk about, which has a great incentive to develop its own nuclear weapons, is definitely Vietnam. It doesn't have its own nuclear umbrella, and China has attacked it multiple times. There was, of course, China outright invading it, and they've had skirmishes in their navy. So Vietnam definitely is a country like South Korea or like Japan or like Taiwan that has an incentive to develop nukes. Australia, while more out of the way, I think without the American nuclear umbrella, they really have an incentive to develop their own nuclear weapons as a deterrent in such a scenario too. And your result there is that you're getting this move away from this kind of bipolar paradigm, or maybe almost bipolar, right? North Korea, I guess, could act as an independent actor outside of China, but China's capable of whipping North Korea into shape if North Korea were to truly act out. But with the America phasing out of East Asia, then you could quickly see all these different countries or powers developing their own internal nuclear weapons. And let's say Japan, that they're the biggest country, the most capable country economically, and probably militarily, to develop nuclear weapons. I don't think that South Korea or Taiwan or Southeast Asian nations, that they can really be united under Japanese leadership in the way that American leadership, both as an outsider from the region, so that the natural biases that come from that aren't involved, but also America's just so much stronger than Japan. It just makes sense. I think even if Japan developed its nuclear weapons first, and it was in some kind of league, some kind of anti-China mutual defense force, some kind of East Asian NATO without the United States, I don't think South Korea or Taiwan or any Southeast Asian states or Australia is trusting enough alone of Japan to defend themselves. And I think in such a scenario, these Asian states, and I guess with Australia, New Zealand, Pacific states, they will develop nuclear weapons of their own. And you got to keep in mind with the Southeast Asian countries, you're kind of creating this wild card there, this kind of spider web of other countries which could come into conflict against each other, and that they would have nuclear weapons. And then you're breaking away from that kind of bipolar paradigm too, that there's this multiple ways that you could have fraction with each other. And Europe too. Europe today, as we see it, because of the United States acting as this, again, incredibly more powerful than any individual actor, and incredibly capable military compared to France or Germany or Italy or United Kingdom or Poland, any of these kind of middle-sized actors, it's able to unify Europe together as this outsider, very powerful country. Well, if the United States falls back into itself, then can they hold NATO together? Can they hold the European Union even together without their own internal fractions as smaller powers pushing away from each other? I mean, France's own instability is pushing at, right now, is pushing at a dissuasion of the European Union alone. Now, imagine a European Union without the backing of America in NATO. Imagine NATO trying to rest on the agreement of France and Britain defending the rest of them with their nukes. Would Germany really count on France to be the only one to still have nukes? Would Poland? Why wouldn't Germany want to have their own nukes just in case? Why wouldn't Poland want to have its nukes just in case? Why wouldn't Italy and Spain, and so on and so forth? Why wouldn't any of these countries want to have their own nukes just in case? Because without the United States in NATO, there's nothing to really hold it together. The NATO states, or America's Pacific Asian allies, they need the United States as something to orbit around and kind of as this powerful middleman helping them negotiate with each other. Without the United States, there's not really any center, I think, to hold that alliance for a sustained period. I mean, obviously, if China's coming all out, they would act. If Russia's coming all out, then the rest of NATO as it consists today, without the United States, I think that they would act together. But as time went on, the inner frictions there would develop, and that alliance structure would break down, and that you would see a region that would be filled with medium-sized powers, a region like the Middle East. And the Middle East, you know, bringing nuclear weapons there, it's never going to be bipolar. It will. Oh, the incentive would always be multipolar. We know that Israel has nukes, and we'll touch on that later because Israel's nukes are very dangerous. But you know, Turkey shares nukes with the United States. Turkey has an incentive to get their own nukes. Iran has an incentive after Israel attacked them to get their own nukes. If Iran has nukes, Saudi Arabia has an incentive. Saudi Arabia, after Israel's criminal behavior and, you know, Israel's connections to the United States, who's supposed to be their umbrella, their deterrence against Israeli aggression, you could say, or I guess aggression in general, they turned to Pakistan to be their umbrella, their deterrence, right? So already the Middle East is a multifaceted region with interplay between states in a way that Asia and Europe certainly aren't. Any kind of proliferation in the Middle East will radically increase nuclear weapons between different states that do not have unilateral alliances against another bloc. It will be, you know, Iran versus Pakistan, Israel versus Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Iran versus Israel, and so on and so forth, Egypt versus vice versa, Turkey versus. And so the more that you have different vectors of possible war with nuclear weapons, the more likely that you'll have a nuclear war, because there isn't that diplomatic infrastructure that can exist. If it's only this this bipolar possibility of war, then the infrastructure for diplomacy is a lot easier. But you know, the more vectors there is to have the war, the more serious the consequences will be in order to launch that war forward. And I want to hit on something else outside of this whole problem of proliferation and more likely vectors of conflict. And that is the perception that states work as rational actors. And so that we can assume that they work as rational actors. Now, we assume that because of that, or we like to think because of that, that a state that gains nuclear weapons will be tamed by the logic of mutually assured destruction. As we know, throughout the Cold War, level heads prevailed, the United States and the Soviet Union, because of the logic of mutually assured destruction and the fear of what a nuclear war would look like. They never went to war. But conversely, India and Pakistan never went to war, right? So that kind of backs up this perception that, well, state will become a rational actor. Except for India and Pakistan, and I want to say, we'll just say this, their populations are less capable, right, than Russia and the United States. India and Pakistan, despite not going into a full-fledged war since Pakistan got their nukes, or I guess since India got their nukes, they've had numerous border wars. The blood lost between India and Pakistan once they have nuclear weapons is not minimal. So I think that, you know, just because there was no nuclear war between Russia and the United States doesn't mean that there won't be nuclear war between other countries. Russia and the United States might just be, because of, say, more functionality with them as peoples, to be blunt, didn't go into a nuclear war. But Pakistan and India, they haven't gone into a nuclear war yet, but their close calls, you could say, are much, much closer than any calls between the Soviet Union and America or Russia and America, because their close calls often result in small border wars. So you just got to keep that in mind. And I also am just going to say this. women are more aggressive when it comes to conflict. If you look into the history of female world leaders, they tend to be much more of warmongers than men. And now you could try and spin that in a feminist way. You could say that women have this sense of inferiority as leaders, and that makes them more aggressive to overcompensate. I mean, I don't think most feminists will even go along that line. They'll just deny reality when it comes to this. But the reality is that women tend to be much more aggressive when they're at the helm of a state. And, you know, most of the leaders with these past close calls, they've been men. Well, as we have seen recently, NATO has become more female in its leadership. And the smaller states that have female leaders that don't really have any military presence, those female leaders are the most bellicose in their rhetoric. And as we know infamously, after the October 7th attack of Hamas on Israel, the people that brought up the option of just using a nuclear weapon straight up out of revenge to just kill as many Palestinians as possible, it was a woman that did that, right? I know that this just sounds like just vulgar misogyny on my part, but I think that the reality is that female leaders are just going to be less interested in weapons, technology, and understanding it, less interested in understanding how warfare works and its consequences, and that they're going to know less about military strategy. And I think that all those combined make it so that they are more likely to not think twice about provocative moves that could lead to nuclear war or starting a kind of war of aggression that could end up in a nuclear war. I think that that's just the reality. There's not really a way around it. They tend in leadership to be more aggressive, especially when it comes to warfare. And we got to talk about this whole madman fear, this madman of the man that attains nukes. And the madman is usually made out to be North Korea, right? We know that Khrushchev and Kennedy and Brezhnev and Reagan and so on, all these people, they're rational. Well, the Kim family, they're irrational. They're a danger, right? Or Pakistan, it's unstable, so there's this danger of a madman military leader using nukes against India. Well, they always talk about the Kim family in specific being this madman scenario that would be willing to start another Korean war when backed up into a corner, or that they're going to use nuclear weapons as some kind of international blackmail against the international community in the case of they're going to be overthrown, or a civil war is going to happen, or they're facing serious famine. You know, I think that the reality is that hasn't come to pass in North Korea. But I don't want to say that that means that every power becomes rational when they have nuclear weapons. That it makes them act more rationally because they see the danger in them. Because there is an example of a madman with nuclear weapons. And that example is Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel is the real rogue state with nuclear weapons, not North Korea and not Pakistan. They're the real danger, or the major danger I see with a rogue state using its nuclear weapons. And there's so many examples of this, of Israel attacking neutral countries or countries it's not at war with since Gaza happened, attacking Hamas diplomats in other countries, and so on, and the multiple attacks against Iran before it led into the 12-year war. Israel with nuclear weapons under Benjamin Netanyahu in the Gaza war, they're completely unresponsible. They're a rogue state that does not follow international rules. And the reason that they cannot follow international rules is because they have nukes and the Arab countries don't. Israel can do all these things to them, attack private citizens and them neutrally, or just attack military facilities outright is ended up happening in the 12-year war because they have nukes and the other side doesn't. They can do provocative actions which in any other scenario would the other person would be completely justified in defending themselves and starting a war over it. But because they have nukes, the Arab countries and the other countries in the Middle East just kind of have to take it on the chin. And you could say that, well, it's not just because Israel has nukes. It's also America. But that doesn't change the whole issue of a rogue state with nukes. It only moves the problem back towards the United States. You're just making Israel an extension of the United States, right? And that even if Israel's the one in the driving seat, or America's on the leash of Israel from the Israel lobby there, it's still the same thing. It's still the United States in the guise of Israel then acting with impunity to break international law because they're empowered by their nuclear weapons and the other side's lack of them. But I think talking about the 12-day war, that brings up another point, because I think that the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and then ultimately with the American intervention, I think that presents a danger of nuclear proliferation outside of nuclear war. And that's that the 12-day war and ultimately the 2003 invasion of Iraq, these are wars that were conducted by an aggressor, a nuclear aggressor, trying to actively prevent or justifying the war by attacking the other side because they were on the verge of developing nuclear weapons or trying to develop them or something like that, right? And so proliferation doesn't just create the danger of nuclear states fighting each other with nuclear weapons. It also, the drive towards using to developing your own nuclear weapons creates this timetable or this window of opportunity in the other state that country is opposed to, which forces them to act. And so if you have runaway nuclear proliferation, then you have the increasing likelihood that you're going to have future wars in which a nuclear power is going to preemptively attack its enemy, as in those two wars, to try and prevent it from developing nuclear weapons, a kind of frantic rationale under this timetable before they ultimately develop the weapons. And so that also puts the defender kind of in a really bad situation. You either have to accept the hegemony of your oppressor, or you have to secretly try and develop nuclear weapons as a deterrence. And so it just kind of creates a much more unstable international order. And I think that these preemptive wars that we're seeing from nuclear-armed nations against nations that are supposed to be developing nuclear weapons points back to a reality I was talking about earlier, that the most likely nuclear wars, I think, are not mutual nuclear wars between mutually armed states, but they are between a nuclear-armed state and a non-nuclear armed state. And the only argument that I have, like the greatest argument I should say in defense of this, is that we have a nuclear war, World War II. And that's what happened in World War II. The side that possessed nuclear weapons used them against the side that they didn't. And there's a great logic. If you have nuclear weapons, you have this great advantage over your opponent. They're going to have to fight you conventionally. You could wipe out their infrastructure. You could destroy cities wholesale. You can destroy fortifications. You can damage amassed armies with nuclear weapons. And their capacity for conventional warfare against you is massively diminished. And you can use your nuclear weapons as a cheat code to disarm your opponent. And yeah, sure, in 1945, in the summer of 1945, Japan, it could no longer win the war outright. But America and its allies, seeing the immense cost that it would take in fully pacifying Japan, Truman didn't hesitate. He used the nuclear weapons to end the war. Likewise, the most serious, other than some kind of international accident, the most serious point that we've gotten towards using nuclear war since World War II, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was the Korean War, was when a conventional power humiliated a nuclear power in nuclear warfare. When the United States was about to unify all the Korean Peninsula under the Republic of Korea, and they were going to march up to the Chinese border, the communist Chinese, they advanced into the country, and they humiliated and routed the American and South Korean and all their allied forces, the United Nations intervention. And MacArthur seriously considered and presented to Truman using nuclear weapons against this conventional foe which was defeating them in battle. And had he used them, certainly China would have been brought to their knees, but the loss in life, I think it would have been much greater than the loss in life that we saw with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because the reality is, any use of nuclear weapons in warfare, they're so powerful that they're and so outmoded by other weapons that any use of them, even if not mutual, is something that we don't want to have. And I think, turning more topically to the current day, if Ukraine truly could defeat Russia, if it truly was on the verge of, say, taking back Crimea, or were it capable of mounting a full-scale invasion of Russia itself, I think that Russia, they would turn to use nuclear weapons because they would be existentially threatened by them. And that the Ukraine war, I think, like the Korean War, that there is a certain sense of danger of it turning nuclear if Ukraine was actually winning. And I think that this is borne out by the uses of chemical weapons since World War I. When chemical weapons, to far my knowledge, they've only really been used in 3 separate wars since World War I. The Second Sino-Japanese War, the Iran-Iraq War, and controversially, I guess you could say, of who used them, but the Syrian Civil War. And all 3 of those times, they have been by a side that can use them, and the side against a side that can't use them. It was, the side that had the capability was willing to use them against the side that didn't. And the logic of mutually assured destruction, as seen with the use of chemical weapons since the First World War, it doesn't play out when one side has the advantage and the other doesn't. And the Syrian Civil War, that opens up what I think is the most likely route for a nuclear war. And that's the possibility of using nuclear weapons in a civil war. And I mean, this seems weird because the way that nuclear weapons are always talked about in fiction and in all these like World War III scenarios, it's nuclear power on other nuclear power, international war. But since the development of nuclear weapons, international war is much rarer than civil war. And so, is it impossible for a nuclear state to have a civil war? No. Pakistan's had civil wars. They haven't had full-on conventional civil wars, but Pakistan has been a host to armed conflict. So I think the 2 most likely nuclear wars to happen, which would, either of these cases happening, would result in hundreds of thousands or millions of dead, is Russia empowered to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine to defend itself if it's losing pretty badly in a conventional war, or that you have a full-on conventional war breaks out in Pakistan that they would use nukes against each other. And Pakistan's not the only country in which you could have this type of conflict. The Soviet Union collapsed, right? If the Soviet Union went south in a different way, you could have had some kind of Yugoslavia war result, right? If there was some kind of, what happened in Moldova with Transnistria was similar to what happened with the various Serbian independent republics in Croatia and Bosnia. What if you had Russian independent republics during the collapse of the Soviet Union and you had some kind of Ukraine-Russia conflict in the course when Ukraine still had nukes. That could have certainly happened. That's, in my eyes, much more likely of even a mutual nuclear war than the whole Warsaw Pact versus NATO thing. And, you know, the reality, guys, is that the United States, France, Britain, they're becoming more and more unstable. And, I guess it's kind of a meme to talk about, a civil war in the West. They're too rich and stuff. But with their instability, their declining democratic norms, and with mass immigration to these countries, which is unchecked, which is resulting in an extreme amount of ethnic tension. I don't know anymore. Like, you people say that I'm optimistic when I say that. You don't understand the reality of how bad something would be. If France and Britain get to the point where they take so many immigrants in, you're going to have this extremely polarized society in which the native population was disenfranchised by its elite, and these immigrants they become the majority of the population. Do you think that that's going to be a stable country? Do you think you want to have a Muslim immigrant Arab plurality France and African and Muslim plurality France still armed with nuclear weapons? You think that that's going to be a fun place? That's not a place that's unstable, and liable to an actual civil war? It's got nuclear weapons and it's got plenty of nuclear reactors which can be mined for dirty bombs. Doesn't seem like a very safe scenario. And again, if the United States declines, or Russia declines, and China declines in relative power, just any of those states, but even America staying at its current power, but the rise of China and Russia as independent blocs, as I said before, means that there's this increasing need for proliferation, or increasing justification for it, because the nuclear umbrella is going to be less and less reliable in the future. Pakistan will then not be the only state which has endemic civil war, endemic civil conflict traditionally, outside of the future scenarios of France or Britain or America, their founding stock, or the country that's named after, losing their majority. You could have more countries that have endemic civil conflict throughout all of their history have nuclear weapons, and this likelihood of a nuclear civil war just increases. And keep in mind that, any use of nuclear weapons is going to result in hundreds of thousands dead, probably, right? But nuclear weapons, even in not your apocalyptic NATO versus Warsaw Pact stuff, if they're going to be used, they're going to result in a terrible refugee crisis. The refugee crisis you saw with Syria and Iraq and all that in the 2010s, and Libya, that could result from a nuclear war. You're going to see the biggest refugee crisis in history. I think people that are racist against South Asians, they make all these jokes about, go at each other, Pakistan and India. Do it. Just do it. If they had a minimal nuclear war, they had a nuclear war between each other, it would destroy their infrastructure and create the greatest refugee crisis in the history of the human race. The most destabilizing refugee crisis you can imagine. A refugee crisis that would be as destabilizing as the collapse of the Soviet Union, or even World War II itself. That's the reality with that type of amount of refugees you would get from something like that. So the danger of a nuclear war isn't just the war itself, but it's the destruction of the infrastructure involved would just collapse the country and lead to a terrible refugee crisis. So overall, I think nuclear weapons are a double-edged sword. They provide an incredible deterrence, and that they help prevent war. But conversely, the desire to attain that deterrence increases the chances of war. Likewise, just because they've always acted to deter war in the past doesn't mean that we should just assume that the likelihood of their use is always going to be zero. There are other things other than mutual nuclear war that can be envisioned. and are perhaps much more likely. And so nuclear weapons are always a danger, not just for their use and their potential destruction, but also in that their development provides the justification for wars outside of their own use. So I think despite them not being a public nuisance or widely thought about by the public, that, the the doomsday clock is trashed and it's only about it's only about global warming now. Global warming is nothing compared to the threat of nuclear war. It's just that the lobby for demolishing the arms industry since the Cold War, that's gone away. And so the political interest in nuclear weapons has gone away. But the threat of their use has increased. And we ignore that at our own peril.